Did you know that when someone views pornography, that actual physiological changes happen in your brain?
Like literally, the brain is rewiring itself. It's amazing that that process can take place. We're going to talk about that today.
So here's the typical story of what we see when people get hooked on porn. There are a few different ways that this happens, but either they have curiosity, they just are curious at what it would look like, or sometimes they're just bored, they're just sitting at home doing nothing and they stumble upon it. Sometimes it's a result of lust. They have this desire and they're like, I need to see something. And then a lot of times it's accidental exposure. So they're at school and somebody shows them a picture and then it sends them down that road or whatever, however.
And sometimes the accidental exposure could be as a child or as a young teen. And nowadays, children are exposed to pornography very early on. And so they don't, seek it out again until later when they're alone or they have a smartphone. Mm-hmm. But that appetite was whet back when they were exposed to it accidentally as a child. So that's the story of quite a few people, actually.
The internet is a bottomless pit.
Yeah.
And so you go and you start looking and you find things, that you could never imagine. What's crazy is your smartphone has this inside of it. Mm-hmm. It has it inside of it, and we have to be so careful about what we put before our eyes.
So what happens is you view the pornography, you like it, your brain responds well to it, and we'll talk about what's actually happening in your brain. Yeah. But then you want more of that. And you find that the risk is actually pretty low. It's pretty easy to not get found out. And you don't have the risk of rejection. So rather than going to your spouse and initiating sexual activity and risking rejection, your mind is on what's the next search term that I can use to find something that I can respond to, that my brain will respond well to. And you don't risk that rejection.
So instead of thinking of your husband or your wife, when you're away from them, your mind, like she said, starts going back to this, I can search this, I can search this. Mm-hmm. The problem is, too, is when you're searching those things, you find other things that are related or not related, and you just keep going down this path that gets darker and darker and darker and takes you to places that you never would dream of going.
So you get stuck in this artificial fantasy land.
Yeah, and when the real thing does come around, they're impotent. Mm-hmm. They're unable to perform. And this really causes stress. Mm-hmm. This causes anxiety, especially if it's a secret sin, like, is she or he going to find out?
Right.
So it causes a lot of problems in the marriage.
And for a lot of men, it causes erectile dysfunction. That is the case for a lot of men who view pornography. For a woman, it might be that she feels less desire for her husband because she's been stuck in this fantasy land online, seeing these artificial scenarios play out, and it's so romantic. And the desire for her husband is weakened because she's formed this bond with the pornographic experience.
Right. And they feel backward because they can have sex with a computer, but they don't feel desire or don't feel like they can perform for their spouse.
Yeah.
And this causes depression. Mm-hmm. And there's physiological, not just, I can't perform, but there's physiological changes that happen that cause depression and less desire to experience the world, less curiosity in the world. So this is something that must be addressed.
So let's talk a little bit more about what actually happens in the brain when you're viewing pornography.
Yeah, the science behind it.
So Sam Black wrote a really neat ebook called The Porn Circuit. And this ebook, you can find it online. I think it's actually free if you subscribe. It's put out by Covenant Eyes. And what in this book, he talks about the neurotransmitters and the hormones that are involved when you view pornography. And then he talks about how each of those neurotransmitters and hormones contributes to this neuro cocktail of the problem.
Right. And our chemicals, the chemicals in our body, these all work together to create a beautiful intimacy between your spouse. And that's the way it should be. God designed it that way.
Yeah.
But what happens when you view porn, it actually hijacks the system, hooks you to something that's not real, a fantasy land. And it's like putting junk food down your mouth from a fire hose. It totally hijacks the system.
Yeah.
And really causes serious damage and long-term ill effects.
So a few of those neurotransmitters and hormones, you've probably heard of dopamine. So what happens when you view pornography or you're having sex, dopamine is released. And it's released into a region of the brain that's responsible for emotion and learning. And it also just produces this sense of craving. So it tells you, go get that thing. I've got to have that thing. So
the next time the viewer gets the itch for sexual gratification, small packets of dopamine are released onto the brain, and this drives them to get, I got to get this next urge. Go here, and you'll get this urge met. And the dopamine really is the push. It's the thing that pushes you toward that thing that your body thinks is great.
Yeah. When dopamine is released, it's a reward system. So you feel this sense of reward when you give in to whatever the dopamine is pushing you toward. And the dopamine also helps you remember, because it helps with learning. So it also helps you remember what happened last time, and it tells you go back there to get it again.
The brain actually works the same way with all things that make us feel good. So for instance, exercise. People love to exercise because it makes them feel good. Food makes you feel good. Drugs make you feel good. In the same way, just things that shopping makes you feel good.
So you get this dopamine release each time you're engaging in one of those rewarding activities.
Right. So it works the same way. So Gary Wilson cited a study that shows that sexual gratification is twice as, viewing porn is twice as strong as the dopamine release for food. So you know how many people can't control themselves with food? It's twice as strong. So porn is twice as strong as that urge for eating. So just to show you how powerful, once you get into this negative addiction cycle is.
Yeah. All right, so a few other chemicals and hormones that are part of this process that are worth mentioning. Norepinephrine. This gets released and creates a sense of alertness and focus. It's kind of like the brain's version of adrenaline. It tells you, okay, something's about to happen and we need to get ready for it. So it's that anticipation when that occurs, kind of leading up to this pornographic experience or sex, that norepinephrine is released.
Another hormone that's released into the body is oxytocin. People call oxytocin the love hormone, and it actually puts long-term memory into the cells of your body. And when you have any sexual experience, your body binds itself, or your mind binds itself to the thing or the object that gave them the sexual gratification. So when it's done in a correct way, when you're intimate with your spouse, you bind yourself emotionally, that when you feel that emotional connection, a lot of times that's over the years the oxytocin that's been released as you're having that experience. So you bind yourself to your partner, but you could see the problem of binding yourself to thousands of images or binding yourself to a computer screen, a fantasy land, and this is really problematic.
And each part of that process becomes a binding object. So it could be the phone that you actually are binding yourself to, or it can be an app, the image of that app that you open up. If it's YouTube, your brain can actually bind itself to that YouTube experience. And so, you could be looking up something completely innocent on YouTube, but because you've already had that binding experience to other things on YouTube, then you actually might trigger right then and go into that driving state where dopamine is released and you start craving that pornographic experience.
Right. It starts the addiction cycle.
Mm-hmm. All right. So another part of this process is the release of endorphins. Endorphins are natural opiates, and they kind of give the body a high, a sense of pleasure that just kind of comes over the whole body. And then after the sexual release, serotonin levels also change, and that gives you a sense of calm and peace. So again, this whole system, the circuit, it's just rewarded. There's no part of it yet that comes with shame or guilt until after that sense of pleasure, the serotonin levels are adjusted, and then the prefrontal cortex turns back on, and that sense of guilt can actually set it.
And you could see how beautifully and wonderfully our bodies are designed for our mate, for our spouse. I mean, God has really done a beautiful job. But when we abuse the way our body is supposed to be used, I mean, just like drugs, it hacks all these different feelings. You still have the dopamine release and the serotonin, all these other things that are released in our body with drugs. The same thing can be said about the addiction cycle with pornography. Mm-hmm. And so we have to safeguard and protect our bodies, our minds, and our spouses throughout our lives by putting safeguards in place so that we never fall prey to this sort of damaging addiction.
There's a lie that people often tell themselves when it comes to pornography. And this lie comes out of, it's motivated by a few different things, but one is curiosity and then lust. But they'll say, I'm not the addictive sort. I'm not going to get addicted to pornography. I'm just curious. People talk about it. I'm just going to look at it once, or I'm just going to look at it every now and then. And so I won't be addicted though. And so they tell themselves this lie without realizing that there's a process that takes place called tolerance.
Yeah, so tolerance happens in your body. Just like your brain could get used to a terrible smell, like if you've been to the dump before, it smells terrible when you go, but you start getting used to it. Mm-hmm. The same thing happens with our brain. We get tolerant to what you're watching. And then you have to have more and more of it in order to satiate that need. Mm-hmm. Another thing that happens is as you get those dopamine hits, those little packets that we talked of dopamine in your brain, your dopaminergic system becomes less sensitive to the dopamine. And dopamine is so important for just your everyday life, to enjoy, like to get excited about a cup of coffee, or to get excited about going to church or reading your Bible, or to feel that drive or passion to do something. That's your dopaminergic system acting upon your brain. Right. And so what happens is you down-regulate. It's harder to get excited about things. It's harder to just enjoy life around you. So that system really is impacted. Your whole life is impacted by this secret sin.
In fact, Gary Wilson actually cited a study that showed the subjects who were involved had a steady decrease in arousal when they were watching the same pornography video over and over. But then when they were introduced to a new pornography video, that arousal spiked again. And so it wasn't the nudity that was so exciting, but the novelty.
And herein lies the problem. You can supply yourself online with an endless supply of mates. You could just go through hundreds of them. What's scary is you could see more in 30 minutes than the most promiscuous person could see in a lifetime 100 years ago.
So with all of this being said, we've shared a lot of the science with you, and we've talked a lot about this concept really of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself. And we can look at that and we can get really disappointed. We get depressed about that and say, oh man, like I'm doomed. But what's really cool is that neuroplasticity that takes place to rewire in the direction of pornography and the wrong direction. You can actually have that same process take place to rewire in the right direction.
Our brains, like Krista said, are very moldable and changeable.
Yeah.
And so we need to move ourselves toward healing if you are in an addiction cycle, and stay healed, stay healthy.
Yes.
If you have never delved into this, is something that everyone needs to stay away from. And we'll be coming out with some technology to help safeguard us, our spouses, our families, and some resources to help people that are stuck and are addicted to pornography.
And one point to make here too is that neuroplasticity takes time, but a lot of people have this false idea that time heals.
Right.
And actually time doesn't heal in and of itself. You might think, oh, I'll wait a couple years to talk to my spouse about this because I'm going to just kick it on my own, and time will heal. Time doesn't heal. Action over time heals.
Right.
And so you got to take action. So
Yes.
we're gonna really push that in our next video and talk to you about actions and steps that you can take.
So we'll be praying for you.
Yes.
Please reach out if you have any questions or need help.
Yeah.
We'd love to help.
So stay tuned for the next video, and we'll be sharing those resources.
God bless.